It truly has, though, been an honor to learn about the truly incredible work of DENCHO and to be a part of this celebration today. I also want to acknowledge Natasha Varner and the rest of the staff in planning this event and everyone who came here and is committed to the mission of DENCHO. So this year in politics has been a doozy. Friends, that's like the understatement right of the year. Friends on different ends of the political aisle, Republicans, I have some of those, and Democrats. There's been different levels, I think, of exasperation of times in which they're done with politics. For some of them, it's been Charlottesville. For others, it's been the Take It No protest. For others, it's been the rollback and DACA protections. And so I have a confession. This year in politics almost broke me. I'm a political scientist. I teach in American politics. Teaching and research in the area of American politics has been one of the greatest joys of my life. But this year, it was no longer enjoyable. It was as if the thing that I loved the most changed and became unrecognizable. I realized the ground beneath me was shaking very quickly into 2017 with what the Trump administration called a travel ban, but was, by on all accounts, a Muslim travel ban. Individuals from 7 Muslim-majority countries, including those on student visas and legal permanent residents, were initially caught up in it. And there was a 120-day refugee ban and the permanent suspension of the Syrian refugee program and Syrian refugees from entering this country. The initial order was not reviewed by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the National Security Council attorneys were prevented from evaluating it. The stories of the people who were caught up in this nightmare are many, but I'd like to highlight a few. Slide. Look at that. Wait, no, we already slide. Oh, another slide. There we go. Perfect. Hamid Khalid Darwish was handcuffed and detained overnight at JFK in New York City. Hamid was an Iraqi immigrant who put his life on the line to work with the United States military as an interpreter for over 10 years. He watched his wife and 3 children disappear into JFK as he was held back. Slide. This is an Iranian couple, longtime green card holders, free at JFK after 31 hours of detention. After 31 hours of detention and not allowed to access medication. Slide. This is an elderly Iraqi woman, a mom of an active United States soldier. She was handcuffed and detained for hours and subject to invasive cavity searches. Slide. So this is a story that gutted me the most. This is Sadar Hussein, a 16-year-old boy who was orphaned in Afghanistan by a Taliban bomb at the age of 13 years old. His family died. He had been running and trying to find safety for a long time. And after 2 years of waiting and a drawn-out vetting process, he was 2 weeks away from resettlement as a refugee. He was 2 weeks away from getting on a plane to the United States. When the Muslim ban came down, he felt the door slam in his face, and like many other people who thought the asylum process was over, was left to make sense of an increasing hostile and violent world. The story of Hussein carried particular relevance for me. I'm the daughter of a refugee. My grandfather was in the nationalist regime before Mao and the communists took over. In 1949, he took what he could carry, and they went to Korea. My mother was born in a refugee camp to my grandmother, who has bound feet. A few months after she was born, in the middle of the night, a United States plane came, and they took again what they could carry, which was even less. They boarded that plane, and they came here to Seattle. They were sponsored by a church family in Seattle who understood the duty of citizenship in this country, was to extend a hand and to protect others from violence. Slide. So this is my mother, one of my brothers and myself, clearly when I was much younger. I am because my mother found safety in this country. In the United States, Ray Wachu, Chinese name, became Annette after Annette Funicello from the Mickey Mouse Club. She came to a racist Seattle that was a few years post-Japanese incarceration, a city still skeptical of people who looked Asian. And despite the torment of racist bullies, she finished high school and went to college. She walked 2 miles every day to attend the University of Washington. We are a family of Huskies. Yeah. She would meet my father at the University of Washington a few years later, also an immigrant, and marry him. She worked as a nurse for 16 years before retiring into the most strenuous job of her life, which was a full-time mom to myself and my 2 brothers. On most accounts today, she is thriving. She works out 6 days a week at the gym. She lives more than me. And like any good Asian mom, she tells me all the time that I would look better if I was a little bit smaller. But in January 2017, Annette was not happy. She looked me in my eyes and tells me that if this Muslim travel ban was in place when her family needed safety, she never would have been able to come here and live the life that she has lived. And for an instant, I see it flickering in her eyes that I rarely see, but I know it. I know for my mother and for others who have escaped war or government persecution that they are never too far from these memories. So today I come to you as a daughter of an immigrant and of a refugee who grew up and somehow became a professor. And the rest of my talk, what I want to do is to use my expertise in the area of race, American politics, and law to try to help us understand how we got here and possibly what we can do about it. I do want to say that in the years leading up, I want to say up front that I think part of the reason we get to this moment that we're in right now is the collective silence in the years leading up to this moment. In particular, in the back of our minds, I want us to think about something sometimes I tell my students is a silence gap. So what is the silence gap? The silence gap occurs when people with power and resources remain silent about the discriminatory treatment of marginalized groups because their lives are not directly impacted. All right, slide. All right, so what to do? I like quotes. I like Maya Angelou a lot. Yeah, right. So she says here, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And I've spent a long time trying to understand what it means to face it with courage. I still don't know the full answer to that, but I know that part of the answer is to put the experiences of people of color at the center of this nation's history and tell truths about this nation, even perhaps precisely if they are uncomfortable. When we engage in a process of truth-telling, we get a different type of history and a different set of lessons that are needed to begin the process of healing and democratic repair. So as a professor of American politics, I teach the intro course at UW with like 300 students. Anyway, so I'm always stunned by the silences that persist in the stories we tell about the founding of this country. Throughout this country, we're always regaled by stories of how ordinary Americans, we, the people, stood up to the tyranny that was Great Britain and asserted our rights for self-government. The ethos of this country, the founding story that has endured over time, tells us that the United States has been committed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that our history can be viewed at some level as a steady fulfillment of those cherished ideals, albeit a few bumps, right? Yet casting the founding moment almost solely as triumphant obscures almost as much as illuminates. The framers structurally and institutionally supported the erasure of women and people of color for laying claim on the founding of this country. And in the final draft of the Constitution, the framers inscribed white supremacy right along with equality and individualism. And yet we never talk about it as such. We never place like white supremacy like right there. Yes, I got an amen. I love that. All right. In the popular version of the founding, white supremacy and indigenous removal are viewed as aberrational features of American life. They were things we had to get through, things that we had to overcome. They were not enduring and certainly not institutional. In fact, it is the founding where you see the norm-making around the terror against people of color, especially African and indigenous peoples. We see that in the rationalization of the greatest form of institutionalized oppression, slavery, and we see it in the plunder of indigenous communities. But it doesn't just stop there. Moving forwards in our history, a history that is familiar to many people in this room, of course, in Japanese incarceration, we see what can happen when war is layered upon race, and when a nation is gripped by fear. Many of the legal logics that are currently in operation were developed, I think, during this period. The ethnic targeted around us, the suspension of rights based on war, the race-based surveillance, the loyalty test, and of course, the interrogations. In so many ways, Japanese incarceration showed that this nation was capable of previously unthinkable political and legal violence against its own citizens. And we are told that these historical moments, slavery, indigenous removal, at the founding and Japanese incarceration in the middle of the 20th century, are not who we are. But that's a type of weird lie, a sanitation of history, a refusal to look the ugliness of who we are squarely in the face and deal with it. When you look at the history of this country from the perspective of people of color, there is not a time frame that exists when non-white peoples were not persecuted. I can't find it. All right, so I'm going to move a little bit ahead forwards here because I know y'all trying to get to these cookies. The era that we're in right now, this moment, today, borrows its logic from previous periods of persecution of people of color. But I think where we are right now really begins on 9/11. After the towers fell, when fear took hold, after Congress passed draconian policies, and the federal courts of this nation gave their stamp to obvious constitutional violations. This nation has been willing to stomach a kind of horrific racial violence in the name of national security. It's been something we have been willing to stomach as a people over and over again in our history. So I want to spend a little bit of time to draw out this massive surveillance apparatus that moves into place in the period immediately following 9/11, whereby Arabs and Muslims somehow are now viewed as the greatest threats to our democracy. Slide. So the AUMF, often referred to as the 60 words that changed the world. The authorization for the use of military force was passed on September 18, 2001. It authorized the president to use, quote, all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he, she, determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks. The AUMF has formed the legal and policy foundation for the way the war on terror is conducted. The AUMF considerably broadened the powers of the president to conduct war. It was a relatively short document that seemed to grant the president unlimited and undefined powers during war. It is purposefully expansive, open to a ton of discretion, used by Bush and then used by Obama. So much of what is currently in place in terms of policy and law can be traced back to the AUMF. It has formed the legal justification for the opening of Guantanamo, the Patriot Act, shady military tribunals, deadly drones, electronic surveillance, and targeted killings. All of it has its, you can go back and it has its logics and its basis in the AUMF. The AUMF was not something that was the divine dictate of a ruler or a president. It was a bipartisan decision by both political parties. It was passed unanimously in the Senate and only had one nay vote in the Senate. In the House of Representatives. It was bought and paid for by our fear. All right, next slide. We have to remember that it was our collective angst that gave permission to Democrats in the House of Representatives to rally behind Republicans in the White House under the banner of nationalist, patriotic security with the goal of both reducing our domestic civil liberties and giving us entrance into an everlasting war. In the months after 9/11 in New York City, 5,000 young men from Muslim-majority countries were racially profiled, detained for questioning, and denied due process, some for months. Across the country, people could feel that something was changing. For some, it was their neighbor who now threw a United States flag outside of their home to show their loyalty. For others, it was the burning of Muslim-owned businesses and defacing and shooting up a mosque. Terror had taken hold, and citizenship for those identified as Arab and or Muslim was unraveling. Slide. In response to the changes that were afoot, many local law enforcement departments followed the lead of federal law enforcement and designed new policing strategies. The case of the New York Police Department, or NYPD, is particularly instructive. Immediately after 9/11, the NYPD Intelligence Division transformed its operations from a unit that focused mainly on driving around dignitaries, foreign dignitaries, into a domestic spy organization. I'm not kidding here. The secret spy division was called the Demographics Unit. The Demographics Unit mapped and spied on the residential, social, and business landscape of American Muslims in New York City and its surrounding area. The clandestine Demographics Unit focused explicitly on 28 ancestries of interest, which included almost every Muslim-majority country in the world, and American Black Muslims, clearly not a country. The Demographics Unit received considerable federal funding, and it was directed by a former CIA official. Documents reveal an expansive surveillance apparatus that profiled specific groups of people, not for wrongdoing, but because of what countries they came from and where they chose to worship. Of particular interest for me, I teach at a university, of particular interest for the Demographics Unit were Muslim student associations, MSAs. The Demographics Unit sent informants into Muslim student associations in different universities, such as Hunter College, St. John's, University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers, and Yale. The rationale behind targeting students in Muslim student associations ran the gamut from students who had become more politically active to the choice of speakers. And my favorite was, this is in their documents, quote, organizing militant paintball trips. When the Associated Press, that's the AP on here, the Associated Press broke the story and reported on its existence in 2011, the entire Muslim community in New York City and its surrounding areas, as far north as New Haven, Connecticut, as far south as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had been mapped and surveilled. Over 250 mosques were under surveillance, and 31 Muslim student associations in the tri-state area were under surveillance. And yet, despite this incredible expansion of authority, the NYPD's Demographic Unit never generated a significant formal terrorism lead. The expose of the Demographics Unit by the Associated Press was a huge embarrassment and eventually disbanded. The Associated Press's team also won the Pulitzer Prize for this investigation. But it existed and it surveilled Muslim and Arab populations for over 9 years uninterrupted. and aided by local, state, and federal governments. The AUMF, Federal Racial Profiling, the NYPD Demographics Unit, how is all of this possible in the 21st century? We made it possible, right? Our silence made all of those horrible things possible. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about the American people in the broadest sense. That our fear, our anxiety, our ability to frame others, our unwillingness to see us and them, or to see them as the other, made possible all of these policy moments. Many people believed these individuals were monsters without knowing anything about them. What I've discussed so far is only a fraction of what happened under the Bush and Obama administrations, with, of course, the support of wide majorities of the American public. Given this framework of Muslims and Arabs as the new racist enemy, it is not hugely surprising that the current administration would take the next step to implement a Muslim travel ban. These are not new problems. They may have been packaged better before, but they are not entirely new. They did not arrive in our political world with Trump. The Trump administration may be the amplification of what was, but this administration is certainly not the source. The collective silence around the construction of Muslims as a new racial enemy that has occurred over the last 16 years in this country, as well as the quiet acquiescence as Muslims suffer constitutional harm, has helped to make this moment possible. All right, so what can we do? I'm not proud of what has been going on in this country right now, and yet at the same time, I've never been more hopeful about the future. And I say that with all honesty as somebody who's focused on the political and legal landscape in this country. After the Muslim ban, many of us started to believe that this was not the best of who we were, that we were capable of something else. Slide. So this was the scene outside of JFK in New York City. Similar pictures of protests emerged at airports nationwide, including, of course, SeaTac. So this is what I know for sure. As people who care, as people who come from a history of government oppression and struggle, as people who know what happens when the government takes away our civil rights and our civil liberties, as people who know intimately the vulnerability of American citizenship, it is all of our responsibility to do something. It is our responsibility to resist the comforts of silence and to use our talents, whether it's your camera, your scholarship, your art, your voice, sometimes your pocketbook, to speak out against the current injustices in our country. We don't all have to march. We don't all need to make resistance art, but we are all good at something. And the challenge for everyone here is to contribute in your own way, to be a part of positive change. To be clear, we don't owe it to Arabs and Muslims, we owe it to ourselves. I read history to make sure that I don't go crazy. For I believe that our past can light a way out of the present darkness. We may not have been here before, but we've been here before. And if we don't do something to address the current moment, we're going to be here again. So in this conversation that Tom mentioned that I had with him, there's a lot that I remember from the conversation, but he told me a phrase that, of course, I saw in the program, and that I want to use it now because I think it speaks to the moment. Never again is now. This moment, despite its wretchedness, despite the inability to unlive it, might provide us an opportunity to indicate the best of who we are. So I landed in New York City the day the Muslim ban went into effect. I spoke to a number of attorney friends who work on the legal rights of non-citizens from Muslim-majority countries. I asked them what they wanted me to tell my students. Their advice to me was to not look away, Tell them, tell your students, Megan, that silence is how they win. Their message and my message to you today is that we must pay attention to how Muslims and Arabs are treated and other people of color. The stories of increased surveillance and denial of rights is not a story right now about Arabs and Muslims. It's a story about all of us, about racial progress and the stubborn durability of American racism. It's about if we're able to see how the struggles of people of color in this country are interconnected. Indigenous removal, Japanese incarceration, the immigrant rights movement, and Black Lives Matter. And finally, it's about if we have the courage to take a collective stand against persisting racial injustice. I believe we have the ability to muster this courage, to organize, and to fight back. My mother, in all of her wisdom, has told me that there is no other way to live life. Thank you.